it doesn't say at first that he was a rebel. He might have had a good intention. He might have wanted to go away, get married, start a business. He might have wanted to, invest his father's money and make more for himself. Whatever he wanted to do, we're not told what his purpose was. We're told what happens to him. So he gets his inheritance and he leaves. So we get to the ruin of the prodigal. It says in verse 13 that not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. You have to think about that. His father had a house, farms, had a business, had his own employees, which he paid very well. You have to think, okay, among two sons, how much inheritance was there? Maybe $500,000, $1 million? How long would it take you to squander that? And I tried to think, if I was to squander $1 million, how quick could I do it? We can outdo each other in how quickly we squander it. Because the son, in our day, he might have spent it on clubs and on women and on buying stuff like cars and televisions and homes. He might have gambled it away. How many times do we hear that? Someone goes to Atlantic City or Las Vegas with a little fortune, hoping to amass it into a great big winning, and they lose everything. So we understand what it means that he squandered everything. We could probably do that. Some of us are older, we're wiser with money, but if you really wanted to, you could squander money pretty quickly. And this is what the son does. And oblivious to his financial needs, verse 14 tells us that a severe famine rose up in the land. He was in need. He had to find a way to support himself, because if there's a famine in the land, in an agricultural society, that means that there's not an abundance of crops. So people who own those farms have to hold back their crops for themselves and their family. And those crops can't be sold. They can't be used for profit. They have to be used for food. And so, in an agricultural society, when there's a famine, you have to take care of yourself, your family, and your animals. Otherwise, you're going to lose those things. So there's not an abundance of wealth in this economy if your crops are not prosperous. And so, what's this guy going to do to support himself? He needs to get a job. So he finds a citizen of that country. Keep in mind, he's a stranger in this strange land. A different way of life, probably different religion, different culture. And he has to get a job to support himself. So how's he going to do that as a stranger in this land? Well, he finds something. What job does he get? What animal is he feeding? Pigs. What do we know about pigs in the Jewish culture? It was an unclean animal. So here he is. He's the son with this great inheritance of this wealthy man. He goes into another country and he ruins everything that he has. He wastes everything. And he has to get a job. And he does so. He's feeding the pigs. An animal that would have been ceremonially and culturally and religiously too unclean for him to partake of in the Jewish culture. And so this is what he is feeding. This is what he has been lowered to. Some of us New Yorkers, we think of the Central Park horses and how sometimes we don't like those because they smell and they invade traffic, and because we hear about these things on the news about how they're not so nicely cared for and they're just used for profit. No one really loves these horses. And imagine you were the guy or the woman who fed these horses and took care of them. How humbling would that be? Think of any low type of work that you feel would be completely beneath you, but because of your desperation, you say, this is what I need to do. And so this is what he has been lowered to in this story. He gets a job and he's feeding the pigs. And let's see how that works out for him. It says in verse 16, he would have longed to fill his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And I asked my Sunday school kids, what do pigs eat? Well, they eat scraps of the produce that we don't eat, whether it's roots or peels of the potatoes, the husks of whatever, any part of the plant that you're not going to use to consume. With that, you make it slop and you give it to the pigs. And so he looks at that in a longing way. Oh, you see that stem that the pig just passed by? That looks so delicious. That looks so appetizing. I wish just get a little bite of that. And you have to think, in the story, what are we supposed to think about him? How is he surviving? Oh, you get a little scrap here, a little scrap there. If the pig missed that scrap, I'll put it in the pocket of my robe and takes it back to his room. This is probably what the impression that Jesus wants us to get in this story. This is what he has been lowered to. This is what he has been reduced to. And no one gave him anything to eat. You could think of him back with his boss and his co-workers. Man, I'm so hungry today. I haven't eaten anything since 2 days. They don't really care. Because they're having a famine themselves. So you imagine him with the bucket of pig food, the peels and the scraps and the stems and the stalks and the roots and everything that human's not going to eat. And he's giving it out to the pigs, just longing. He could just taste a little bit of that, how good it would be, how much that would satisfy him. See, that is what he has been brought down to. So that is the demise of the prodigal son. So we've done his departure, we've done his ruin, or his demise. And then we see the prodigal son come to his senses in remorse and repentance. So we have the remorse of the prodigal son. It says in verse 17 that he came to himself, meaning he came to his senses. And he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to eat and to spare? Bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger. This is even the employees of my father who feed his cows and work his fields and do his bidding, they, by comparison, are wealthy. Not only are they probably not in a famine, but they have enough bread for themselves and their families, and they have enough to spare. We see the father was a gracious employer. He paid his employees well. If you have food to spare for others, probably in this society, you're cared for pretty well. And so on that basis, he says, here I am, dying with hunger, envying the pigs. The pigs are fed better than I am. So I will arise and I will go, verse 18, to my father. And I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. So he prepares this speech in his mind. The speech goes like this. Have you ever been in that kind of situation where you have hurt someone, where you have offended someone, and you don't know how to approach them? You're thinking, what do I say? What do I say? And you start planning it in your mind. And you say, well, I would say this. I would say, well, I'm sorry for this, but this is why I did that. And you start planning the speech in your mind. And you start thinking about, well, what if they say this? Then what am I going to say? You make a big plan in your mind to be accepted when you have done wrong. And this is what the son does. He has this plan. He says, this is what I'm going to say. And here's his speech. He says, I have sinned against heaven. I've sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Just give me a job as one of your hired servants. And that makes perfect sense because it's like he's saying to his father, you don't even have to think of me as your son. Just pretend I just came in off the street. I gave you my job application, my resume, and my references. Just give me a job. That's all I want. That is a condition on which he is willing to come back. So he rises up. He goes back to the house of his father. It says in verse 20 that while he was yet a long way off, that the father sees him. The father feels compassion for him, The father runs. The father embraces him. The father kisses him. And then he begins his speech. He starts off, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and no more worthy to be called thy son. But in verse 22, the father cuts him off. He doesn't even let him finish the speech. It says, the father said to his servants, bring forth the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand, shoes on his feet. Bring hither the fatted calf, kill it, let us eat and be merry. The son doesn't even get to finish the speech, and he is accepted on different terms than those with which he came back into the father. So in that, we see the grace of the prodigal's father. The father doesn't listen to his speech. He's willing to make a deal with the father. I'm sorry, don't even think of me as your son anymore, just give me a job. That's all he wants from the father. And he gets better than he expects. He is accepted without the speech, before the speech, and on different terms than the speech. The father calls for his complete restoration. He brings a robe, he brings a ring, he brings shoes, the fatted calf, and makes a celebration. And so this is what Jesus is trying to get through to the Pharisees, that it is completely right for him to rejoice with sinners when they repent. But the Pharisees, that's what the Pharisees did not understand. That's the heart. That's the part of God's heart that they miss. That God is merciful and compassionate. The Pharisees were not. So I think the next part of the parable, the scorn of the prodigal's brother, this is a direct confrontation to the Pharisees. The biggest section of this parable is spent on the prodigal's brother. And this is the section that addresses the Pharisees' hearts and maybe our own hearts as well. So in verse 25 it says that the older son comes back from the field. I want you to notice this, that we see field, both brothers were working in a field. The younger brother in the field with the pigs, the older brother in probably the field of his father, doing the work of his father. But you'll see that both are far away from the father. The younger brother, because he had left and went to another land and ruined squandered his inheritance. And the older brother as well, even though he dwelt with the father, his heart, you'll see, is so far away from the father's heart. So, he hears music and he hears dancing, and he inquires of one of the servants what was happening. And the servant responds to him in verse 27. Thy brother is come, and thy father has killed the fatted calf, because he has received him safe and sound. Brother, you would think would be, if he was a good brother, he would have been happy. He would have rejoiced. But we see that there's anger and hatred and scorn from the older brother. Hear his response. Verse 28, it says, he was angry and would not go in. Therefore his father came out and entreated him. It's like one of the servants goes back inside to the father and says, you know what? Your older son got home. Something's going on. Something's not right. He's kind of angry out there. Why don't you go talk to him? So the father comes out. The father, it says, he entreats him. He begs him. He is imploring him. He is pleading with him. Son, come. Let's go inside. Let's have a good time. Let's rejoice. Let us eat, drink, and be merry. We have something to celebrate about. You know how when you have a happy occasion, a celebration, and then there's someone who just has bitterness and anger in their hearts, and they're spreading it, and they're angry about something, that tends to ruin the occasion. So this is what the older son is doing. All the joy is being drained out of this celebration. That for some reason he doesn't think this is a worthy cause to celebrate. He doesn't want to have a party. And then the accusations begin against the father. In verse 29, here's the speech of the older brother. He says, interesting, they both make a speech, right? Verse 29, and he answering said unto his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee. Neither transgressed I at any time thy command, and yet thou never gavest me a kid that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this thy son, notice he doesn't call him his brother. He doesn't say, as soon as my brother came home, as soon as, the youngest, no, this thy son, he's alienating himself from his brother. He says, as soon as this thy son was come, which has devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed for him the fatted calf. So this is the accusation against the father. He says, you are unjust and you are unfair. You are unfair because even as much as I've done for you, you never gave me a party. You never killed the fatted calf for me. And he says, you are unjust because look what your son did. He ruined the inheritance that you gave him. He ruined it in this shameful way with harlots. He's brought scorn to the family name. And look what you've done. You've thrown him a party. When someone does wrong and they get rewarded, isn't that what we think? Well, if you're going to do good to him, you're proving what they did. He ruined the inheritance you gave him, and you threw him a party. That means you're approving what he did. You are unjust, is the accusation of this older brother. See, the older brother didn't realize the heart of the father. Look at the father's response in 31. He says, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad. For this thy brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. The brother might as well have been as good as dead. Not having heard from him, not knowing where he was. It was as though he was dead. And now, here he is, out of nowhere. It's kind of like Joseph. How Joseph's father, even though Joseph's brothers knew he was sold into slavery, 40 years passed by, they have no idea what could have happened with Joseph. It's as though Joseph was good as dead, and out of nowhere, he's in their lives again.